In a world ravaged by the undead, humanity's tenuous grip on survival was defined not just by the walkers that roamed the earth, but by the desperate choices of the living. The remnants of civilization had fragmented into groups, each vying for their own versions of safety and dominance. Rick Grimes had led his group through countless trials, fierce in protecting their bond and their fragile hope. Yet one moment, a single decision, had always shaped what followed. What if Rick Grimes had chosen to join Negan and the Saviors instead of fighting them? The cool night air was thick with the stench of blood and gunpowder. Rick knelt, his hatchet dangling loosely in his grip, splattered with ichor. The carnage in the clearing was sickening. Walkers and humans alike lay scattered across the dewy grass, their lifeless eyes reflecting the moonlight. Above them, Negan's voice boomed jovially, cutting through the death and misery like a blade. "I've got to hand it to you, Ricky boy," Negan chuckled, gripping Lucille tightly as she rested against his shoulder, still streaked with crimson. "You lasted a hell of a lot longer than most, but look at you now, on your knees, beaten, just like everybody else." Rick's chest heaved, not from exertion, but from the sharp twist of emotion churning inside him. He glanced sidewise. His group's faces, battered and broken, stared back. Maggie barely held herself upright, her face gaunt with rage and grief. Daryl, bound and bleeding, still glared daggers at the man who had wrecked their lives. Carl, standing defiant but terrified, his single eye burning with defiance as Negan sauntered toward him. Rick had nothing left to give. Every strategy, every ounce of strength, Negan had snuffed it out. Alexandria was gone. He knew they'd been outmaneuvered the moment the sanctuary's gates had shut behind their convoy. And yet, Negan wasn't finished. "You see this?" Negan gestured to Lucille, spreading his arms theatrically. "This is what happens when you fight us. When you dig your little heels in and think you can play king of the hill. But my friend, I'm feeling generous tonight." He dropped his voice to a near whisper, leaning into Rick. "Join me, Rick. Be like Dwight, like Simon. Hell, bring your brat too. I could use more people like you. Or," his smile widened, wolfish and cruel, "or I break your precious family into little pieces, right here, in front of you." The offer hung in the air, thick with venom. Rick's knuckles whitened around the hatchet's handle, every fiber of his being screaming to lunge at Negan's smug face. But he was tethered by reality. He could feel Carl's gaze boring into him, pleading. He could see Michonne's trembling lip as she clenched her hands behind her back, Daryl's subtle headshake, warning him off. A fight would end them all. Rick swallowed hard, his voice cracking as he lifted his head. If I say yes, you'll leave them alive?" Negan's grin widened. "Scout's honor, buddy. They'll breathe another day." Rick closed his eyes for just a moment longer than a blink, then nodded. "Fine." Negan clapped his hands together, his laughter cutting across the clearing like the crack of thunder. "Well, goddamn, welcome to the winning team, Rick." The months that followed were a slow bleed of Rick's soul. Negan had kept his end of the bargain, for now. And Rick found himself ensnared in the Savior's web of brutality. His group had been scattered. Maggie and a few others had escaped to Hilltop, while Daryl had vanished entirely the same night Rick had agreed to bow. Michonne and Carl stayed by his side, unwilling to abandon him, even as his new role grew darker by the day. "Sierra, what does this mean?" She would go to Mans with grace, but she begged for Ginneth with grace. "This mean I must be Rick." Negan wasted no time in putting his newest asset to work. "You're a leader, Rick," Negan had told him during one of their first conversations in the sanctuary, over a dinner that felt more like a taunt than anything cordial. "You know how to keep people in line. That's why you're perfect for this gig. You enforce. You convince. And if convincing doesn't work, well, you do what you gotta do." Rick's first task had been overseeing the collection runs. At first, he'd tried to keep it tame, doing everything in his power to negotiate with other communities, to minimize the suffering. But Negan always had eyes everywhere, and resistance was met swiftly. This was no democracy, no fragile attempt at barter. It was a dictatorship of extortion secured by fear and blood. "You're too soft," Simon had sneered after Rick allowed a family of farmers to keep just one more crate of supplies than they were ordered to surrender. Rick barely had time to argue before Negan made him watch as Simon burned the family's home to the ground. "This ain't Alexandria anymore," the savior lieutenant growled. "Get with the program." Carl had watched the transformation in his father with a growing bitterness. Where once he'd seen a hero, his hero, he now saw a hollowed-out version of the man, a puppet dancing on Negan's strings. The boy hated it. Hated the sight of Rick standing silent as Negan wielded his power without consequence. "I don't get it, Dad," Carl snapped one evening as they sat alone in their quarters at the sanctuary. "Why are you doing this? We could fight them. I could help." "It's not that simple," Rick replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Not anymore. Not after what I've seen him do." Carl slammed his fist against the table. "So what, you're just gonna let him win? Let him tell you how to act? That's not the dad I remember." Rick looked away. It was true, he didn't even recognize himself anymore, and that scared him more than Negan ever could. But even as Rick bent, his resolve never fully broke. He'd seen enough of Negan's operation over time. The cracks, the dissent within the ranks that brewed just under the surface, the selective incitement of violence. A man who had been buzzed enough long ago to melt into the scene without rendering. The cracks, the dissent within the ranks that brewed just under the surface. Though Negan presented himself as unbeatable, there was still rot coursing through the Savior's core. Rick began to plan in secret, waiting for the right time to strike. He made peace with what that plan would cost him. "I have to be on the inside to destroy it," he whispered to Michonne during a rare moment when they were alone and unchecked. Her eyes searched his face, softened by the flicker of rebellion she saw reawakening there. "Is this what happens when you pretend there's no overduty?" She nodded, her hand finding his. "I don't like it," she murmured, "but I'll stand with you." Carl heard the plan too, though he wasn't supposed to. The boy's admiration for his father had wavered, but hearing some shred of the fighter Rick used to be reignited a small spark of respect. Carl made up his mind right then that he'd help, whether his father wanted him to or not. The turning point came sooner than Rick expected. A rift among the higher-ranking saviors gave Rick his opportunity. Simon, ever ambitious and prone to violent excess, grew disgruntled with Negan's methods. Rick seized on it, subtly fueling the bitterness, nudging Simon toward open rebellion. When the moment came, it was chaos. The sanctuary erupted into violence as Simon led a faction against Negan's loyalists. Walkers breached through an unguarded corner of the compound, adding to the frantic melee. Rick had prepared for it. A signal blasted through the night, summoning allies he hadn't contacted in months. Maggie came with hilltop reinforcements. Ezekiel and the kingdom fell in line. Even Daryl emerged from the shadows, older and angrier than Rick remembered, but still an ally Rick could trust. As the battle raged on, Negan's group found themselves crushed between Simon's split faction and Rick's new alliance. Rick confronted Negan in the carnage, their gazes locking as they stood amidst the wreckage. "I gave you a choice, Rick," Negan growled, breathing hard as Lucille threatened another swing. "This is what happens when you fight me. You lose everything." "Maybe," Rick spat back, glaring, "but at least I'll still know who I am." There was no hesitation when Rick buried his hatchet into the side of Negan's head. The self-proclaimed savior leader crumpled, Lucille slipping from his grip as he collapsed. It was over. It wasn't victory that greeted them in the aftermath, just the cruel reality of what fighting cost. The sanctuary burned, its former inhabitants scattered or dead. Rick stood among the rubble, Michonne and Carl at his side. His group was whole again, though scars ran deeper than the eye could see. For the first time in months, Rick allowed himself to look Carl in the eye. "I'm sorry," Rick said, his voice breaking. "For what I became." Daryl appeared in the distance, his crossbow slung over his back, his gait uneven but steady. He looked older somehow, dirtier if that was even possible, but his expression was sharp with focus, unsoftened by sentimentality. The others gave him space as he approached, the years spent apart from the group having carved something primal into his demeanor. He stopped when he saw Rick, studying the man briefly before speaking. "Hilltop's clear," Daryl reported. His voice was low and gravelly, his Tennessee drawl cutting through the tension. Rest of the saviors scattered, but it ain't over. They'll regroup. Factions or no factions, there's always somebody hungry enough to kill for control. His eyes flicked to the scorched compound behind them. We're just buying time, Rick. Rick nodded but said nothing. He knew Daryl was right. This fight with Negan had been just one piece in a never-ending cycle of bloodshed. The world had collapsed into a game of power, alliances, and survival, and no matter which piece you were on the board, the rules never changed. Daryl's gaze lingered for a moment before he spoke again. You were right to kill him, for what it's worth. That bastard took too much from too many people. Rick exhaled sharply through his nose, his jaw tight. It doesn't feel like enough, he replied. It never does, Daryl said. Maggie arrived later, her presence commanding as it always was. Her gait was determined as she marched toward Rick, her ponytail flicking behind her, specks of ash and blood dotting her skin. For a moment, she only stared at Rick, her chest heaving from exertion. When she finally spoke, her voice was sharp, almost accusatory. Was it worth it? She demanded, her words a blade cutting through the fragile calm. Tell me, Rick, did all of this, did Glenn die for this? Rick froze, struck by her words, as though she'd spit in his face. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Deep down, he'd asked himself the same question 1,000 times, since the day Negan swung Lucille in that clearing and destroyed the man Maggie loved. Maybe that moment had defined all of them. Maggie's grief, Daryl's rage, Rick's fall. So much hinged on the decisions they'd made since that night. And now, even with Negan gone, the weight of it bore down on them like a stone pressing into their souls. I don't know, Rick admitted finally, his voice raw. You think I've got all the answers? I don't. We make these calls because we have to, not because we know they'll fix anything. His eyes flared with a wild desperation she hadn't seen before. All I know is he ain't here anymore, and I'm still standing, just like you, just like all of us. That's the damn truth. Maggie stared him down for a long moment. Finally, she nodded, though the sadness in her eyes never left. You're right, we're still standing, she muttered, but the dead don't just leave us behind. Don't forget that. Nightfall came quick, the final embers of the sanctuary dying as the wind turned colder, harsher. They camped just outside the compound, taking turns on watch as the sound of distant walkers filled the dark. Rick sat by the faint remains of a campfire, his hatchet polished but worn, his hands tightening around the handle every time the breeze picked up. Michonne sat quietly beside him, while Carl had curled up against her for warmth, finally dozing after hours of quiet contemplation. It didn't end with Negan, Michonne whispered, her breath misting in front of her. This fight, this cycle, it's just gonna keep coming for us, Rick. Rick turned to her, his jaw tightening. I didn't expect it to, he said. His eyes flicked to Carl, his face softening slightly as his shoulders slumped. My cell phone rang, she said, smiling slightly as his shoulders slumped. Oh, but maybe it doesn't matter if it ends or not. Maybe all that matters is that we keep standing. Michelle nudged his knee with her own, offering him a faint smile. You're still fighting. Maybe that's who you are. Rick gave her a small, tired smile in return, though it fell as he tilted his head toward the direction of what once was the sanctuary. Carl's still just a kid, he said. But when I look at him, I see someone older. Someone harder than I ever wanted him to be. Guess the only thing that scares me more than losing him is seeing him live long enough to turn into me. Michonne squeezed his hand, her grip firm. Carl's got a piece of Lori in him, she said. That boy's tough enough not to lose himself. So are you, Rick. Rick didn't respond. Across the camp, Daryl cleaned his crossbow in silence, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness for any flicker of movement. His face screamed out in the snow, strained with every movement. For the first time in a long time, they were all together. What was left of them, anyway. Still, the fragile unity felt tenuous, like a thin sheet of ice stretched over a freezing lake. Any misstep, and they'd all sink. Rick didn't sleep that night. As the dark hours passed, his thoughts churned endlessly. Negan was dead, but his specter lingered. Would the world remember Rick Grimes as the man who destroyed the Saviors, or as the man who gave himself to them to buy time. Had any of it been enough to make up for the lives they had lost? When dawn broke, the orange-pink streaks painting the sky seemed almost mocking in their beauty. Morning meant the fight for survival began again. Rick rose, his hatchet in hand, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He wasn't numb anymore. He was resigned. The morning was unnervingly still, a deceptive peace draped over ruins and broken men. Rick stood at the edge of the wreckage, the cool wind biting his face as he stared past the curling smoke and beyond the horizon. It wasn't quiet, not completely. Faint moans drifted in the distance, the telltale sign of walkers shambling toward new remnants of humanity. He could already feel it, the weight of another day crushing what little strength he'd managed to piece together in the brief, bitter hours he'd rested. Behind him, the others stirred. Michonne moved with purpose even now, helping Carl pack his meager belongings into a makeshift satchel. Daryl was awake, of course, his crossbow slung across his back, tugging at the straps on his vest as he surveyed the camp. Carl hampered the sack. Maggie and Jesus lingered near the remnants of a nearby vehicle, their voices low and urgent, no doubt deliberating their next course of action. There was no room for silence anymore, only whispered plans and fractured alliances held together by spit and grit. Rick didn't dare look at them. Not yet. "What's the plan, Rick?" Daryl's voice sliced through the morning stillness like a blade, gruff but steady, carrying with it the expectation of action. He stopped a few feet away, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. Rick felt himself hesitate. The muscles in his throat tightened as the words tried to form, but they wouldn't come. For the first time in a long time, he wanted to admit he didn't have an answer, that the choices he'd made to get them to this point weren't guided by strategy, but by survival. That his plan now was just to keep their heads above water until someone, anyone, came to drag them under again. But he swallowed that truth and forced strength into his voice. "We regroup at the hilltop," Rick said flatly, turning to meet Daryl's hardened gaze. "Rebuild. We'll need food, supplies, people willing to fight. No resting. Not now." Daryl tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, something skeptical, maybe even resentful. He didn't argue, Daryl rarely did anymore. He just gave a short nod and turned away. The path toward Hilltop was long and twisted, cutting through decayed highways and dense woods. Every step weighted with uncertainty. Some roads were blocked by overturned vehicles, weeds bursting through cracked asphalt, remnants of humanity's retreat. Other paths felt too open, too exposed, as though the world itself watched them tread carefully, daring them to falter. They moved as a unit. Maggie and Jesus took the lead, their eyes sharp and wary. Daryl hung near the rear, listening for any sound that suggested pursuit. Michonne and Carl flanked Rick, close enough to offer support, but far enough to give him space he didn't ask for, but sorely needed. No one said much, and when they did speak, it was hushed, clipped. Even Carl's voice, once filled with boyish energy, had been swallowed by the somber air that followed them. Rick tightened his grip on the hatchet at his side. He didn't trust the silence, not anymore. Silence only ever brought trouble. By midday, they reached an old gas station on the outskirts of a derelict town. The structure was partially collapsed, its roof caved in on one side, but the others insisted on stopping. People needed water, food, whatever they could scavenge to keep their strength up. Rick relented without argument. They dispersed quickly inside, spreading out among the scattered debris. It was Carl who found the lone walker. He'd ventured deeper into the station than Rick would have preferred, and by the time Rick caught up, Carl was already there. The snarl of the walker echoed faintly from the bathroom, the scraping of its fingernails against the metal stall door sending shivers down Rick's spine. Carl stood in the middle of the room, his knife clutched tight, poised but not swinging. "What are you waiting for?" Rick asked quietly, stepping up behind him. Carl tensed but didn't look back. "It's stuck," he muttered. His voice was calm, too calm. "I blocked the door with that chair. It's not getting out." Rick frowned, his eyes flicking to the crude barricade Carl had constructed. Sure enough, the walker's legs were pinned behind it, keeping it in place. Not enough to incapacitate, but enough to trap. Its growls grew harsher when it saw them, its decomposed hands jerking wildly in their direction, reaching hungrily. Rick stepped forward, his hand instinctively going to his hatchet. "Then kill it," he said gruffly, fighting back the exhaustion cracking at the edges of his voice. Carl shook his head, just slightly. What's the point? It's not gonna hurt us like this. It's just... There... Rick stiffened. He felt Michonne's presence before she spoke, her soft footsteps approaching from behind. Carl, she said firmly, but not unkindly. You know we can't just leave it. You also know why. The boy finally turned to face them, his jaw set, his single eye glinting with muted anger. It's always the same thing, he said coldly. Kill this, move there, fight them, then do it all over again. He motioned back toward the walker, who clawed futilely at the air. This thing, it's not even a threat anymore. It's pathetic, and we're wasting time trying to deal with it. Rick felt his chest tighten. Carl's words cut deeper than they should, filled with a bitterness that unnerved him. He saw himself in his son more than he wanted to in that moment. Saw the way the world had stripped the boy of his hope, leaving behind something colder, sharper. It doesn't matter what it is, Rick said flatly as he stepped closer to the struggling walker. What matters is we've got to survive, and moments like this, they define whether we do. Without another word, Rick swung the hatchet hard, cleaving through the walker's skull with a sickening crunch. Its struggling stopped instantly. The room was silent once more, save for the faint dripping of congealed blood onto the linoleum. Rick turned back toward Carl, who stared at him blankly, unreadable. His son's expression didn't shift. It didn't soften, didn't harden. It was just resigned. They left the station not long after, their bags heavier with supplies, but their spirits weighed down further than before. The incident with the walker hung between Rick and Carl as they walked, a growing tension neither seemed willing to acknowledge outright, though Michonne occasionally glanced between them, her worry evident. By the time Hilltop's walls came into view, the sky was streaked with orange and gray, the sun dipping low. Rick felt his shoulders ease slightly at the familiar sight. It was more than just safety. Hilltop represented a sliver of stability in a world that constantly shifted beneath their feet. Even damaged from previous battles, its walls were still standing, a testament to all they'd fought to hold on to. Maggie and Jesus moved forward to announce the group's arrival. As the gates creaked open, there was a rush of activity inside. People poured out to greet them, familiar faces mixed with new ones, survivors from Alexandria, Kingdom remnants, new arrivals looking for a home. For a fleeting moment, Rick allowed himself to believe rebuilding was possible. That night, the fires burned bright inside Hilltop's walls. Food had been prepared in celebration, what little they could spare, though the mood remained somber. Negan's death had brought relief to many, but the scars he left lingered too deep to heal quickly. After a while, Rick sat in quiet isolation near the edge of the gathering, his thoughts loud against the muffled sounds of conversation and laughter building around the fires. Lucille had been left behind outside the sanctuary's ruins, but he could still feel the ghost of its weight in his hands, lingering. A weapon, a symbol, a memory. Maggie approached him cautiously, a cup of water in her hand. She hesitated before sitting beside him, her posture stiff but not unkind. They're looking to you, she said matter-of-factly, her voice soft but firm. Rick didn't look at her. I know. Maggie studied him, her green eyes searching for something in his face. Finally, she exhaled sharply, setting the cup down between them. You're not the only one carrying this weight. Don't act like you are. Rick clenched his jaw, still staring into the firelight. Feels like it sometimes. Maggie's voice hardened slightly. We all lost something. Rick, Glenn, Abraham, Sasha, but every single one of us is still here because of what's left. Because we've got people who still count on us. Finally, Rick turned to look at her. He saw the steel in her expression, the fire that kept Maggie Rhee standing even when the rest of the world demanded she fall. He nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. The fire burned low by the time Rick finally stood, his movements slow and deliberate as he stepped away from the gathering. He found Carl outside, sitting atop one of the makeshift platforms that overlooked Hilltop's walls. The boy didn't turn as Rick approached, nor did he speak. You okay? Rick asked quietly, his voice carrying just enough warmth to break through the chill in the air. Carl shrugged, but didn't look away from the dark expanse beyond the walls. The world's still out there, he muttered. doesn't feel okay." Rick climbed up beside him, not bothering to suppress the groan that escaped as his knees protested the effort. He settled in beside Carl, his hands gripping the edge of the platform as he followed his son's gaze into the night. "I want to believe it gets easier," Rick said after a long silence. "But I can't lie to you, Carl. It doesn't. We just get better at fighting it." Carl nodded faintly, his expression unreadable again. "I'm tired of fighting," he admitted softly. Rick placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing it gently. "Me too," he said. "But it's all we've got."